Chapter 5. The Funerals. Over 500 people attended the funerals of Robert, Sarah, and Stephen Carlson. They spilled out onto the lawn of First United Baptist, which wasn't even the Carlsons' church. They were Methodists, but the only one in town large enough to be up to the tasks. Folks came from all over the country and even into the Dakotas, people who had never so much as met one of them. The viewing line before the 3 ivory caskets stretched so far beyond the parking lot and took more than 2 hours. It was a hell of a thing, seeing those 3 caskets draped with roses and daisies and closed so tightly. One of them was Stephen's side. Steve, who a week ago had run into me accidentally in the hallway, and those were our last words, our last interaction, an inane cluster of laughter and fake punches. It didn't make sense that he could be dead, that he could be killed, and be killed in his own house, just lying there without fighting. None of the victims ever seemed to put up a fight. I don't understand how it could have happened, I whispered, and my dad squeezed my shoulder. I don't either, but we shouldn't talk about it here. My family was already singled out because my father was a sheriff. All eyes were upon us when we approached the caskets. Except for little Patricia's. The surviving toddler squirmed in her aunt's arms, in the front row, chubby fingers reaching for the wide brim of her aunt's black morning hat. She looked so unknowing, so happy. I wondered what she'd seen in her house that night, what she would remember. If when she grew up, she would have her own story to tell. I looked away to see Matt McBride. He was there covering the funerals, and he'd been watching me as I watched Patricia, so I slipped away from my family and made my way over to him. Hello, Mr. McBride. Hello, Michael. He shook my hand. How are you? I'm all right, sir. How are you? Is your wife? Over there talking to Bob Carlson's brother, Neil. He smiled. I think she just doesn't want to be seen with me when I have this camera around my neck. He held it up when he said so. I'd seen him before the service started, taking photos of the caskets draped in flowers, and then again photographing mourners in the viewing line. Other out-of-town reporters had been stopped at the door, but Mr. McBride had known the Carlsons, and we were used to seeing him around photographing us at events and at the county fair. I remember thinking how at ease he looked, how professional. He knew I wanted to be a journalist someday. I blurted it out one afternoon that summer when I was delivering papers for him, and he talked with me about it for a long time, even though he'd been on his way out the door. We stood in front of the offices of the Star, in front of the windows with the title emblazoned across them in flaking gold paint, and he let me ask him about everything I could think of. I heard you were at the house that night in one of the search parties, he said. I'm sorry, that must have been hard. I nodded, and he looked at me sympathetically. Well, Michael, he said, I won't keep you, but if you need anything, I'll be around. After the funerals, Percy and I went to the boat landing on the south edge of Eyeglass Lake, a hard-to-find hideaway for upperclassmen and the occasional bunch of kids hunting frogs or turtles. It's not used much anymore for boating or fishing. The water teems with weeds and lily pads. Eyeglass Lake may have been clear as a paint of eyeglasses once, but that was a long time ago, and my dad and his deputies generally consider it too much of a pain to keep an eye on. Percy backed his car up so that it faced the road and set the parking brake so we wouldn't wind up in the drink. And then we got out and leaned up against the tail light while he got 2 beers from the trunk. Watch the rest, he said, as I popped the top, and I slid over a few inches to keep it from staining my good trousers. After a few swallows, Percy said, I've never seen that many people crammed into a church before, or that many unfamiliar faces. Me neither. Did you talk to her? He asked. Who? Don't play dumb. Marie Catherine Hale, I said. Yeah, I saw her. So, what's she like? I don't know, a girl? He threw something into the water, a rock maybe or the top of his beer. I heard they're charging her with the murders, but that can't be right. It isn't right. Not exactly. They want her to give up her accomplice, the real killer, but she hasn't yet. The real killer, the man who had done it. No one believed that it could have been her. She was a girl, and girls don't kill. She was small when Monty Locherno had been big. She was weak when Steve and his father had been strong. But no one had any problem believing that she had helped. Your dad must be going apeshit, Percy said. He's talked to Judge Vernon yet? No one knows what to do, I said. The truth was my dad, our prosecutor, even our judge were out of their depth. The bloodless murders had crossed state lines and had multiple seemingly random victims. They'd never encountered anything like it. What does that mean for the girl? Percy asked. They won't put her in the chair? Minnesota doesn't have the chair, I said. I knew that because I'd asked my dad the same question. When we had capital punishment, we had preferred hanging. But Nebraska has the electric chair, and that's where it all started. Percy stared at the deep water. Seems stupid of her not to give him up. Seems worse than stupid to let him go free, keep on killing. They'll get him eventually. There had never been more than one bloodless murder in the same town. But just the same, we kept our eyes on the trees. When Percy took his beer and threw it into the lake. What'd you do that for? I don't know. He stuffed his hand into his pocket. This day makes me not want to drink, those caskets and all those people. All those people. On one hand, it was touching that strangers would come and give our community's loss more significance. On the other, it robbed us of our intimacy. But everyone in attendance had been properly somber and restrained. And if a few had stared a little too long, well, that was to be expected, wasn't it? When something was as horrible as that? I took a last drink and threw my beer into the lake beside Percy's. The funerals were an event not because so many strangers had come. It was a spectacle because it was a spectacle. The Carlsons' death had been a spectacle. And that baby, I whispered. I thought of her cherubic reaching arms. I imagined her sitting on the floor of the living room in the Carlsons' farmhouse within a few steps of her dead parents and her dead brother. I imagined Marie Hale standing in the same room, red from head to toe and offering no comfort. Widow Fern Thompson had been the one to telephone Charlie at the sheriff's office. None of us had known her husband. She had moved to Black Deer Falls after he had died and bought a small house with their savings and his service pension. She was well into 60s with no children and was a bit of a shut-in, and every now and then the ladies at her church would get together and go to her house to bring her a luncheon. When she called the sheriff's office, she told Nancy that something was wrong at the Carlsons' place. The lights were still on, and the cat had been meowing to be let in, and she could hear the baby crying. Charlie had been hanging around the station that night, as he liked to do when Nancy was working. Everyone knew he was sweet on her. And with her bright blonde curls and rose-lipped smile, most of the rest of us were sweet on her, too. So he said he'd go out to the farmhouse and take a look. It was Nancy who urged him to get my dad on the radio and bring him along. Charlie tried to refuse. There was no reason to bother my dad with something like that, but Nancy insisted. There was a note in Fern Thompson's voice, she said, that she didn't like. Fern kept a rather constant eye on the Carlsons. She alerted them when the family dog ran out into the marshes or when John P. delivered the mail and failed to close the box properly, like he did sometimes at our place, and the letter spilled out onto the grass. The investigators latched onto that Widow Thompson's habits weren't something that any murderer just passing through could have known. It was further evidence, they said, that the killer was not from Black Deer Falls, as if we had had any doubt. Let's get out of here, Percy said. Where are we going? The park. Everyone's going to be down there to have a drink for Steve. I thought you weren't in the mood to drink, I said. Who's everyone? Everyone who can slip their parents and make it. And they want you there, sheriff's kid. He opened his door and leaned through to pop the passenger side open. So the girl, he said as we pulled out of the landing, is she pretty? What? They say she's pretty. Black-haired, blue eyes, red lips. Her hair is brown, I said, and her eyes are hazel, and she's all of 15 years old. Near 16. It's not like she's a freshman. Is that all you think about? Typical Valentine. I laughed, and when he tried to punch me in the ribs, the car jerked back towards the reed fish lake. The things that came out of his mouth sometimes. Percy was a regular in detention and by now was an expert at washing chalkboards and classroom windows. He was always goofing about his romantic future and his many wives. Sometimes it was 4, sometimes it was 6, like Henry VIII. It definitely had to be more than 3 so he could best his old man. It was a short drive to the park, and when we got there, the sun had just gone down. "Michael Jensen," someone said and tossed me a beer. It happened fast and I couldn't see who it was. The voice sounded maybe like it was Joe Conley or Morgan Todd, both football players like Steve, and to me almost indistinguishable aside from the different numbers on their backs. I cracked it open. "Thanks for the invite." They'd started a fire but kept it burning low in case one of the deputies rolled through. In the orange glow, I could make out faces. Everyone gathered around was all from the football team. I figured they'd extended my invitation for insurance. If they did get caught, at least I had the sheriff's kid there as a shield. As for Percy, he was an always welcome addition for his clowning, and since he could usually score the most beer. We stood around and drank to Steve. One beer disappeared, and then 2 and 3, and Percy played his usual trick of lighting his shoes on fire. Those closest to Steve, the ones he would have called his best friends, weren't there that night, and I was glad. It was too soon. "So have you seen it?" Joe Conley asked. "The house, I mean." "Why would I have seen it?" Percy asked back. His usually affable voice was sharp with warning, and I realized he'd had less to drink than he'd been putting on. "I just thought he might. His dad's the sheriff and he works at the jail." "I'm just asking is all. I mean, who are they sending to clean it up?" "Nobody," I said. "Charlie and Bert have already been through it taking photographs, but my dad says the FBI is sure to want a turn." "The FBI?" Morgan said, and I whistled. "And Black Deer Falls? Who'd have thought the biggest murder spree in the century would end up here?" "Who says it's over?" said somebody else. "You think the girl did it by herself?" "None of this makes sense," Joe said and wiped his face. "I half don't believe it. I half think those coffins were empty. I wish they were." He looked at me. "If we went to Steve's, who would be there to stop us?" There's a state police car parked there from dawn to dusk." But it was after dusk. Chapter 6. The Carlson Farmhouse. We knew it was a bad idea, but something had come over us, standing there together with the fire going, the grief and beer combined with blurry feelings of shock, and the pent-up frustration of a long summer of light sleep and locked doors. Not a one of us said we shouldn't go. We just piled into our cars and drove north on the long stretch of County 23. The drive wasn't more than 15 minutes, the last stretch of it out on the back roads unpaved. We spotted a line of pheasants crossing in our headlights just before we got to it, a few hens and a rooster, his dark green head feathers flashing, and Percy pulled over well shy of the start of their long gravel driveway. Joe was with us in Percy's car, and the rest of the guys followed in 2 cars behind. "No sign of a cruiser," Percy said. "Maybe we should still drive past and take a look." Joe exhaled and twisted in his seat to look around. Up the road stood a red mailbox with the Carlson's name on it printed in white paint. It was a pretty place, I'd always thought, a white gabled house with gray shutters nestled in a copse of maple trees. They could have stayed late, parked behind the barns, Percy said, and nodded towards them. 2 large barns, red with white trim in the daylight, but only hulking shadows in the dark. "Don't be chicken," Joe said, and when I didn't say anything, Percy threw the car into drive. We pulled right up beside the front porch, like we would have if we were stopping by to see Steve or picking him up to go to the drive-in over in Pelican Rapids, 2 things we had never actually done. We stared up at the house. Already it seemed haunted, though not by ghosts. I had no notion that we would go inside and discover the specter of Steve and his murdered parents. The house was haunted by the experience. It had been strained by the horror that took place within its walls, and even though it stood empty, it would never quite feel empty again. "Oh, hell," Percy said suddenly. "What?" "Widow Thompson is sure to have seen us. She's probably on the phone to your dad's office right now." "Maybe not," Joe said. "Maybe she's still out with the rest of them at one of the repasts." I looked closely at Fern Thompson's place. Someone would have picked her up and taken her to the funeral. But they might have also dropped her off again and with a small casserole to put into her refrigerator. If she was home, of course she had seen us. She was watchful before and would be even more so now, and it made me sad to think how afraid she must be living so close to something like that, and how much lonelier she would be without the Carlsons' lives to look in on. I opened the car door and stepped out. "What are you doing?" Percy exclaimed and got out after me. Mrs. Thompson knew who I was. I hoped she would understand that we were not here to gawk, but because we needed to see, that she would understand when we didn't quite understand ourselves. "Fern Thompson is a nice lady," I said to Percy. "She took in Steve's cat when none of the relatives seemed to want it. My dad told me." "Oh," Percy said, "that was good of her, and it's good to think that they both have company still." He turned towards Mrs. Thompson's house and gave a little wave in the headlights, turning on that Valentine charm that I had to admit let him get away with more than he ought. I turned back to the Carlson house. I wondered how long it would remain the Carlson house, and the memory of Black Deer Falls probably forever. But it was a nice place on a nice plat of land. It would be a shame for it to stay vacant, to fall apart slowly, its beams sagging, dust and cobwebs taking over the shelves and corners. They didn't deserve this, I thought, and I met every one of them. Steve and his family, the house, his cat, and his old hound dog. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Percy asked as Joe got out and the other cars rolled in and shut off their lights. But nobody answered. We were there already. We went in through the back door. "Christ," Percy said, examining it. "It doesn't even have a lock." "Lots of doors don't have locks," said Joe. Maybe they didn't used to," he corrected them, "but after the summer..." He trailed off. Lots of locks had been added once the murder started. No one really imagined we would need them. We stepped farther into the house, and Percy and some of the other guys flicked on their lighters. We let Joe lead the way through the mudroom and then the kitchen, with the pantry off to the right. It was freshly clean, the cupboards shut and the dishes put away. A pair of salt and pepper shakers shaped like little milk bottles rested beside the stove, and I got the sense that someone had tidied it up. Maybe even Bert, after the photos were taken and the room was processed. It was something I could see him doing, going through the kitchen and setting things right that had been knocked over. "This feels weird," Percy said. "Like breaking into somebody's house." He winced. "Well, I know we are, but you know what I mean." "Yeah, I know what you mean. We were breaking into somebody's house. Except those somebodies were dead. The house remained filled with so much of their lives. Family photos, a stack of clean folded clothes on the bottom step of the staircase. Shouldn't have surprised us, I guess. But it did. We were walking through the last echoes of the Carlsons, and each new personal thing that rose out of the darkness into light from our lighters made us jump. "We shouldn't be in here," one of the others whispered. "It feels wrong." "Then you shouldn't have come," said Joe. "No, I mean the house feels wrong," he hissed back. It was true. The house was beginning to lose its lived-in feel. It had been mostly shut up since the bodies had been moved out, and the homey smells of cooking and fresh fabrics and Steve's mother's perfume had begun to settle into the carpets. It was starting to smell like the old farmhouse that it was. I tried not to breathe too deeply, afraid to catch the scent of dried blood or rot. I imagined I could smell it, even though I knew the blood at the scene had been mostly on Marie Hale. And even though I knew that Steve and his parents' bodies hadn't lingered for more than a few hours. Percy walked into the hallway, footsteps light like a cat's. He reached out and touched a bit of lace beneath a painted vase full of dried flowers, careful to keep the flame of his lighter at safe distance. "This could be any of our houses," he said. We looked at each other uncomfortably. Even though the lace and painted vase were nothing like it was inside Mo and Janine's place, it really could have been any of our homes. It could have been any of us lying dead that night. We walked through the hall, and Percy put his hand on the banister, his foot rising to rest on the bottom step beside the pile of folded laundry. "Well," Percy said as the stair creaked. "No need to go up there, right?" I looked over his shoulder, through the wide-open square that led to the living room. Joe was already there, his lighter tilted towards the floor. It was bare except for the chalk-marking lines. I stepped past Percy and went into the room where the Carlsons had died. Their living room was only a little bigger than the one in our house. Fireplace was set at the south end, and above it, a dark wooden mantel clock. It was no longer running and had stopped at 10:22. The electricity to the house had been shut off, but I didn't know when, so there was no way of knowing whether the clock had been stopped intentionally after the murders. Joe pointed at the floor and asked, "What do you make of that?" I shrugged. I couldn't make any more sense than any one of the marks and numbers the investigators had made in chalk. But staring at it, there was something disturbing about the impertinence, as if the whole of the murders could be blown away by a good wind or rubbed away with our hands. "There's not much here," Joe said, sounding disappointed. He turned to the couch. It was untouched, unstained, and not the slightest bit askew. "Hang on," said Percy. "Did you say that girl came covered in blood? Like, covered in it?" "Yeah." "So where is it? Where's the rest?" We looked around. It infuriated me suddenly to think that Steve and his family had died in this sterile, preserved room. That they had died without a fight, without screaming, with Mrs. Thompson settling into her rocking chair just across the driveway. "And it's weird that this floor is bare," said Percy. "Was there carpet? Maybe Bert and Charlie tore it up." "No, there used to be a rug here," said Morgan. He pushed through us and bent down. "Under the couch! There's something under the couch!" We dropped to our knees and tugged on it, a large rolled-up rug. Bert, Charlie, or my dad must have rolled it out of the way to mark up the floor. We looked at each other in the eye and then unrolled it across the wood. There was blood on the rug, all right, though not 3 bodies' worth. Instead, there were several small pools, close enough together that we could imagine it all. Which came from the first body, and which from the second and third. We could imagine how they lay, each close enough to the other to touch. "Christ," Percy said, "we should get out of here." "Don't get sick," I cautioned. I'd seen him get sick over a deer before. As recently as last season, when he shot one younger than he thought she'd been. A big fawn, essentially, barely out of her spots. "I won't," he said, but he was breathing hard like he was about to. What the hell is that in the middle?" I bent to peer at the center of the carpet where spots of red dotted the rug in an uneven circle. Blood had been smeared and tracked from there in small footprints, and there were smudges near where the body's blood as well. I swallowed. "That's the girl." It was where Marie had stood as all the blood on her hair and clothes dripped down. "Something's not right," said Joe. "How did she get covered in their blood? It's too clean." He gestured to the carpet as his voice grew louder and decently loud in the quiet. "Take it easy." "There must be more. Where is it?" She had been coated in all of their blood. I'd seen it with my own eyes. I stared at the small, sterile spots where Steve and his parents had died, where they fell, where they lay. How did it get from their wounds onto her, thick and wet and smeared across her face, soaked into the roots of her hair, red running down the ends? Enough to saturate her clothes from her shirt to the socks in her shoes, like it had been poured over her from a bucket. Walking around on the unrolled carpet, trying to imagine Steve and his parents' final moments, I'd nearly forgotten that anyone else was there, and Percy yelped, "Jesus!" and grabbed me by the elbow. "What?" I half shouted. His arm stretched out, his lighter was shaking. There was a face in the window. We looked, but whatever he had seen was gone. Nothing there but darkness and the shadows of Mrs. Carlson's lilac bushes. "I don't see anything," Joe said. "It wasn't there," Percy said. He said it and not they, and for some reason it made the back of my neck prickle. "Where there?" I asked. "Just there. Standing or crouching, a man and woman, maybe Fern Thompson." "It wasn't Fern Thompson," he said and gave me a look. But he couldn't explain who it was. The face had simply been there, he was sure of it, pale and up close and staring. And then it was not. We didn't have much time to ponder it, because that's when we heard the distinct sound of tires crunching up the gravel driveway. Oh, shit, Morgan said. Quick, help me roll this up. Joe bent down over the rug. Lighters went out, and we hurried to the sides of the carpet, holding our breaths against the faint scent of blood. I guess old Widow Thompson wasn't as understanding as you hoped. We got to our feet in time to hear the back door open and for Charlie to yell, Percy Valentine, Michael Jensen. I couldn't help but notice the way his tone changed between our names, unsurprised for Percy and disappointed for me. We hurried back through the hallway and into the kitchen, and when he saw us, he shook his head, his hands on his hips, feet spread wide like a gunfighter about to draw. And the rest of you, let's go, boys. Yes, sir, we said and walked quietly past. What the hell were you doing in there? You didn't mess with anything, did you? No, sir. As we got into Percy's car to follow Charlie to the station, Percy asked, So how long did Widow Thompson give us before she called you in? Widow Thompson? Charlie squinted quizzically. I just saw the backs of your cars when I passed by on the road. I looked across the yard to Mrs. Thompson's house. She may not have called us in, maybe hadn't seen us drive up at all. She was watching now. I could see her plainly against the yellowed lace of her curtains. She had Steve's tomcat, who I later learned was called Mr. Stripes, nestled in her arms. Is it just you, Charlie? I asked, even though I saw only one patrol car. Bert didn't come? Just me. Then who was in the window? Percy whispered.